For most people, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are mainly a curiosity, historical trivia, you might say. Nothing especially relevant to politics in the present. But I was recently rereading the Lincoln-Douglas debates, a thing, I do. I'm a big nerd. I like this stuff. I was rereading the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and I actually think they have a lot to say about how to conduct politics in our moment, especially if you are someone who considers themselves progressive or liberal or what have you. But even if not, I think they have something to say about how to do politics in our present moment. First, what were the Lincoln-Douglas debates? Now, the Lincoln here is obviously, I hope obviously, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. But he wasn't running for president in 1858. He was running for Illinois Senate. And at the time, you'll recall, maybe you won't, I don't know what you know, prior to the 20th century, with the passage of, I believe, the 17th Amendment, senators were not elected directly by the public. They were selected by state legislatures. And so Abraham Lincoln is running for Illinois Senate, which means he is in effect running to win the votes of the people who will choose the legislators who will select the next senator. This made Senate elections sort of de facto popular elections, and in a lot of ways the 17th Amendment was just ratifying a change that had already taken place in many states across the Union, but that's a separate conversation about how we got the 17th Amendment. For now, that's what Lincoln's doing. He had served in Congress a decade earlier. He was an opponent of the Mexican War. He was a Whig. He was a great admirer of Henry Clay. Henry Clay he considered to be kind of the lodestar of what politics ought to be, and Clay was the most prominent Whig in the country, multiple-time presidential candidate. At the time, it was pretty normal for people to serve just one term in Congress. You serve a term, you go back home, you come back, you serve a term, maybe you try out for another office. There was a lot more fluidity in how people served in government. They may serve in the House and then the Senate, and then they might go back and serve in the State House. Maybe they'll be in a cabinet, in a presidential administration, a lot of stuff like that. So Lincoln served his term, went back home, but was not engaged in politics, was very much engaged in politics throughout the rest of the 1840s and 1850s, was a prominent Whig political figure, and someone who was known for being an opponent of the expansion of slavery. And so when the Republican Party takes shape in 1854, he is one of the people in Illinois who is one of these original OG Republicans, someone who is part of this political coalition as it forms from the remnants of the Whig Party, from anti-slavery Democrats, from what was once the Free Soil Party, from what was once the Liberty Party, and even from what was once the Know Nothing Party. Big coalition of various factions, all kind of united to the opposition, all united by their opposition to the spread of slavery. So that's Abraham Lincoln. Now, who's Douglas? Not our good friend Frederick Douglass, but Stephen Douglas, the incumbent senator from Illinois, known to many as the Little Giant. He was a small man, but he had a huge personality and was an incredibly powerful and influential member of the United States Senate. Was one of the key figures behind what would become the Kansas-Nebraska Act, establishing popular sovereignty in the territories. Now, what was popular sovereignty? Popular sovereignty was the idea that the people of the territory should be able to choose whether they want slavery in their territories or not, regardless of where that territory lie on the map, whether it was above or below the Mason-Dixon line. This was a repudiation of the Missouri Compromise of 1820-1821, which held that for every free state admitted above the Mason-Dixon line, there'd be a slave state admitted below. The even admittance of free and slave states to maintain a sectional balance. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was incredibly controversial, especially among anti-slavery Americans and anti-slavery politicians who saw it less as an attempt to extend democratic principles and more as an effort to cement the influence of the slave power in new territories the United States takes on. The slave power being the term, somewhat conspiratorial term, but not at all inaccurate, for the collective body of power that slave owners held throughout the federal government. They were a majority of the Supreme Court. They had held the presidency for most of the time since the founding and had significant shares, if not outright majorities, in the House and Senate very frequently. Now, Douglas was a member of the Democratic Party, and here, to get a sense of why he thought popular sovereignty was important, why he thought this was the right approach to take for handling the issue of slavery, it's worth thinking a little bit about the history of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party emerges out of the effort to elect Andrew Jackson president in 1824 and 1828. Although Jackson is really the first standard bearer of the Democratic Party in the 1828 presidential election, and the 1832 election especially, the architect of the party is a little Dutchman named Martin Van Buren, American-born, but Dutch is his first language, a New Yorker, and the architect of a powerful political machine in New York. It's Van Buren who begins to unite the pro-Jackson forces, elites, ordinary people, not just in the North, but also in the South. And the Democratic Party that he builds, called at the time the Democracy, which, as an aside, I think is a much better name, and I kind of think people should bring it back. But Van Buren's Democratic Party, he envisions as a bisectional party. Bisectional. The captions don't like that word. They think it's a different word. In Van Buren's vision, you would have Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, all united in the interests of the common white man. What this meant in practice is that within the Democratic Party, you kind of had to set slavery aside, you had to table it as an issue. Northern Democrats would not challenge slavery at all. And in fact, in New York, there's quite a few Southern sympathizers, in part because of the deep economic ties between New York and the South. And in the South, slave owners would not try to impose themselves too much. In practice, critics said this basically meant that the Democratic Party was a slave owners' party. That slave owners were such a powerful faction that this was kind of just a fiction. But the idea was that if you have a party with important bases, important sides, members in both parts of the country, they could kind of suppress slavery as a live political issue and maintain some stability. You can fight politics over other things and leave slavery to the side. The Missouri Compromise also helped made this possible because there'd always be an even split. And the Whig Party that emerges in response to the Democratic Party, the Whig Party emerging out of what was the Jeffersonian Republican Party, and you can kind of think of all of this as the Jeffersonian Republican Party splitting into two parties. One of them becomes the Whig Party. The other, they call themselves National Republicans, becomes the Whig Party. The Whigs are also a bisectional party with Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs, and also a similar kind of decision that we're going to suppress slavery, we're going to keep it aside. The thinking here, and this is all informed by the Missouri experience, is that slavery is such a divisive issue, such a contentious issue that it threatens to tear the Union apart if you let it become the subject of partisan politics. And so to preserve the Union, you have to compromise, and the compromise is to let slavery do its thing and to try to, as much as possible, to keep it off of the national agenda. By the 1850s, this was just falling apart. It was just straightforwardly falling apart completely. Both for what you could call organic reasons. Slavery is growing as the slave economy grows, as demand for cotton grows. As slavery grows and demand for cotton grows, the power of slave owners grows commensurately, their political power, their economic power, and they are desiring more influence in the government. You could say that they are imposing themselves in increasingly heavy-handed ways on American governance, trying to regulate, for example, what mail can be sent south, trying to regulate who can cross borders in the South. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act made this even more acute. Now, Southern slave states were essentially demanding that Northern free states act as slave catchers, violating the states' rights, you could say, of Northern states, who thought that their free state status meant that they had no obligations to assist the South in its manhunting, as they called it, man-stealing. There's also the emergence of a genuine anti-slavery public in the North. It's important to say here, and maybe we'll do a video on this another time, that anti-slavery here does not mean anti-racist, does not mean pro-equality. It really just literally means anti-slavery. That many of these anti-slavery Northerners had no particular love for Black Americans, but did oppose slavery for a variety of different reasons. And the emergence of a genuine anti-slavery public meant the emergence of a genuine anti-slavery politics, a mass politics that really begins to take shape in the 1840s. And that mass politics is in relationship with Southern slaveholders. Southern slaveholders see this as a profound threat, and so they become even more demanding of protection of their rights and what they see as their rights and privileges, which in turn leads the anti-slavery public to get madder and more unwilling to budge. All of this is to say that by the 1850s, the old compact is kind of dissolving, it's deteriorating, it's falling apart. Slavery is on the table as a national issue. It is on the table as a subject of partisan politics, and it is actively tearing the nation apart. And Douglass, who envisions himself a great statesman, says to himself, I know how we can resolve this. We can resolve this by affirming the basic principle of democracy. People can choose for themselves. And we just say, you choose for yourself whether you want slavery or not. The national government doesn't touch it. It's not the subject of the national government. It's you choose, and whatever you choose, we're okay with. Douglass sees this as preserving the Union as it is. And Douglass, like many of the statesmen and politicians of his generation, view themselves in continuity with the founders, view themselves in continuity with the generation that comes after the founders, and they all believe in the preservation of the Union. So Douglass is running for re-election, and Lincoln is his great antagonist. Lincoln is a Douglass hater. And Lincoln enters the Illinois Senate race thinking he can beat Douglass. And the Lincoln-Douglass debates that take place over the course of 1858, 7 debates in 7 cities, are kind of a media spectacle. Lincoln participates in them to raise his profile in the state and nationally. And Douglass wants to prove that his view of the situation, his view of what should be done about slavery, is correct. Now, Lincoln's view of slavery is more or less diametrically opposed. Lincoln says first and foremost that slavery is an evil. It should not exist. But he understands the Union was formed with slavery, and so he does not believe in immediate emancipation, immediate abolition. He does not think that that is feasible. He does not think that that is allowed under the Constitution. And he does not think it's politically wise. He also is, at the time, a colonizationist. So he is not even sure how Black people would exist in the United States. He thinks there'd be too much anger and enmity between Blacks and whites. So his view is that there should be gradual emancipation of the enslaved and that they should be shipped off to Africa. He will change this view. During the war, this view will change. But at the time, he is very much a colonizationist, which you could think of as sort of like the moderate anti-slavery position. His views of what should be done with the 4 million enslaved aside, Lincoln says slavery is evil. And so if we cannot get rid of it where it currently exists, and that's fine, we're going to leave it as is. The Southerners are right. It is their right. If their state's laws say that slavery is allowed, it's allowed. Then we should at least not let it expand. That there's nothing in the Constitution that says that Congress cannot tell the territories that they can't have slavery. His view is that the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, one of the last laws passed under the Articles of Confederation, and a law carried over into the new Constitution, forbids slavery in the Northwest Territories. Think Ohio, Wisconsin, et cetera, et cetera. And that's his precedent. We've done it before. There's nothing to say we can't do it again. And so there cannot be any expansion of slavery because it is an evil, because it's so destructive, because it so violates the basic principles of this country, which he holds to be the principles of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. You cannot have the extension of slavery. And that is his view. In 1857, the Supreme Court held in Dred Scott v. Sanford that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional, that Congress had no right to forbid slavery in the territories, that it was thus invalidated, that slave property could be brought into free states and still remain slave property, which invalidated essentially many of the laws of free states. And that, as I'm sure you know, or if you don't, now you do, that Black Americans had no claim to citizenship in the United States because, in the view of Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who wrote the decision, the framers had not included them into the polity. Lincoln hated Dred Scott, thought it was utterly wrongly decided, and part of the Lincoln-Douglas debates is a debate over Dred Scott, debate over the principles established in that ruling, a debate over popular sovereignty, with Douglas taking the position of Taney, taking the position that slavery should be allowed wherever people want it to be allowed, and Lincoln taking the position that slavery is such an evil that it makes no sense to allow people to decide whether they can enslave others, whether they can enslave other men. Lincoln also takes a position that Black Americans were, of course, included in the founders' vision of citizenship. And even though they may not be equals, Lincoln, like many men of his time, is not a racial egalitarian. and he's criticized for this by abolitionists. Although Lincoln does not view blacks as equal, he also does not think that means they thus must be subjugated. This is the core dispute of Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's the status of slavery, which really means the nature of the Union itself. Now, I opened this video saying that we can learn a lot about politics from these debates, and I am getting there. I'm getting there, I promise. I think we actually were there right now. So Douglas is the incumbent, and Douglas, whose position is that Taney's right, blacks have no right to citizenship, and that territory should be able to have slavery if they wanted to, and that Lincoln, in his opposition to slavery and his willingness to disagree with Taney, in fact, thinks blacks should be equal citizens. Douglas even warns that if Lincoln had his way, they'd be marrying your wives and daughters. Very classic bit of race baiting. Douglas is directly appealing to popular prejudices, popular bigotries, and the status quo. Lincoln has a choice in this. Lincoln can compromise on his core views about the Declaration of Independence, about slavery and its expansion, but even the inclusion of black people in the political community. He can compromise on these things to attempt to maybe get around Douglas. Or he can hold fast, knowing that they may cost him. He can hold fast knowing that they may cost him, but that abandoning them may cost him even more with existing Republicans in the state of Illinois. People who want to see an anti-slavery candidate try to prevail. And so in these debates, you see Lincoln make a choice. Lincoln never backs down from his core commitments. He never backs down from his opposition to the Dred Scott ruling. He never backs down in his belief that slavery cannot expand. He never backs down from his view that blacks were obviously included in American citizenship. Doesn't back down from any of them. He holds fast to these principles against Douglas. But he does make concessions to some popular prejudices. He doesn't try to go ahead of where public opinion may be on the question of the equality of black people. So he's, throughout these debates, constantly saying, I don't disagree that blacks are inferior. I don't disagree that I don't want blacks on equal standing with white men. It's ugly stuff. If you read this, or if you listen to it, there have been audiobooks made of this. It's ugly stuff. It's hard to hear. But as political strategy, it's interesting because he's riding a thin tightrope. He's not budging on his principles. And he's saying, this is where I hope to lead the country. But to the extent that he's appealing to popular prejudices, it's not even really a direct appeal. It's simply not challenging them. Maybe affirming them a little bit, but not challenging them, not getting ahead of where the public is, but trying to draw a distinction between those prejudices and what the policy of the government ought to be. Lincoln's position is, feel however you may, the policy of the government should not be this. It's an interesting approach. It's not triangulation. It's not the kind of moderation that we think of in the present. It comes from a place of conviction. This is what we ought to do. This is what's right. And it's not letting anything else get in the way of that. Lincoln thinks, or we can assume he thinks, he doesn't really write or speak much of this, but we can kind of assume that what he thinks is that getting ahead of the public on its views of black people might make it more difficult to get the public on his side when it comes to his views of the expansion of slavery. And so if at least acknowledging the prejudice means that he can get buy-in for the policy of the government, he'll do it. It's interesting. Now, Lincoln doesn't win the Illinois Senate race, Douglas does. But Lincoln does go on to become the Republican Party's nominee for president in 1860. And he utilizes this same strategy in the 1860 election. Him and his surrogates maintain a laser focus on stopping the expansion of slavery. And when they are attacked for being pro-equality, for being egalitarians, they say that's irrelevant. That doesn't matter. We're not, but that doesn't matter. What matters is the policy of the government, and that's what we're going to pursue. And Lincoln does win the 1860 election. It's kind of a split decision because there's the Democratic Party splits into a southern one and a northern one, northern with Stephen Douglas at the helm. There's a Constitutional Union Party, kind of an anti-secession national unity party, and there's a Republican Party. But of the contestants, Lincoln wins the most votes, wins the Electoral College majority, and wins the presidency. And you see Lincoln adopt this approach of concessions when necessary to sentiment, but holding fast on principles and the position of the government throughout the Civil War. His infamous letter he sends to Horace Greeley, where he states that if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would. He ends that letter by stating that it is his hope that all men are free. And in that letter, he's doing more of this. And so Lincoln says, sure, if we can win this war without freeing any black people in the South, then I would do it. And he also says that if we can win this war and we have to free every black person, then I'll do that too. And ending that letter on his note that he wants to see everyone free is your hint that Lincoln's aim, that his principle remains the preservation of the Union and opposition to slavery. And in that letter, you can see how he is carefully telling the public that the two things may end up being synonymous, that to preserve the Union, you may need to end slavery. And it's worth noting that before he sends his letter, he has already written some version of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he's already planning to deliver it. So the letter, far from being evidence that Lincoln doesn't care about slavery, is in fact a piece of evidence about his political strategy with regard to trying to end it. So what here can we learn from all of this? Right now, there is this argument over how Democrats in particular should approach the electorate, about how they should respond, about how they can defend the rights of the people in their coalition, but also expand the tent and actually win elections. And one view is essentially that Democrats should do everything they can never to get on the wrong side of public opinion, even if this comes at the expense of people within the coalition. Some advocates of this view even suggest that Democrats should essentially offer up some sacrificial lambs. Say, sure, we will agree to policies that may hurt some of our constituents if it means that we can get votes that we need to get. It's a poll-driven politics that is very reminiscent of what is taking place in the UK right now under the Labour Party. Substantive concessions to popular prejudices. I would say the example of Lincoln here is that this is the wrong approach, because Lincoln didn't make any substantive concessions to popular prejudices. He didn't adopt the framing and ideas and perspective of his opponents. He didn't say, Roger Taney has a point. He didn't say, popular sovereignty might be okay sometimes. What Lincoln did, again, was recognize the existence of popular prejudices and calibrated his rhetoric so that he didn't get ahead of them, so that he didn't directly challenge the popular prejudices, recognizing that that might damage his overall political position. But while not challenging the public on its view of black people, Lincoln said, that is not relevant to what your view of the slavery issue ought to be, because it's not about your prejudices, that's about the position of the government. The position of the government has to be broader than your prejudices. The position of the government is to cover all people. So what would Abraham Lincoln do in this situation? What can we take away from his approach? His approach might be to say that a candidate facing an electorate that holds a certain set of popular prejudices probably shouldn't directly challenge those prejudices, probably shouldn't base his campaign or her campaign on challenging those prejudices. But that candidate should make a distinction in their rhetoric and their approach between those prejudices and the position of the government. They should appeal to a higher sense of propriety and equality and fairness when it comes to the position of the government, when it comes to policy, rather than try to enshrine those prejudices into policy. Lincoln might say those prejudices have no place in policy, and that trying to disadvantage people using the government is wrong and violates core principles. Lincoln might say that in order to do this, you do have to have a set of baseline principles that you will not compromise, a set of objectives that you will not compromise, an aim, a direction, a place you want to take your community or take the country from which you will not budge, regardless of what the political climate looks like. That you do what needs to be done to make sure that the people you need to speak to will listen to you, but you do not do that at the expense of basic principles. And that you don't do this at the expense of the people within your coalition already. That's what I think you can take away from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, from Abraham Lincoln's experience as a practical politician on a divisive issue in a polarized time. that it's important to know where public opinion is. You don't want to get ahead of people, especially if that means they'll turn off their ears. But you have to have a foundation, a principle. You have to have something that you're not going to budge on. You have to be able to stand up for those principles and defend those principles. Stephen Douglas has a low reputation in American political history, not just because he lost in 1860, but because his entire approach was about triangulating. It's about finding exactly the right position according to what he thought popular opinion was and adjusting his principles according to this. Lincoln was sort of right about them. There was no guarantee that he wouldn't flip from one side to another. If chasing the public looks like cowardice and running too far ahead of the public looks like unacceptable radicalism, then you have to kind of keep pace with the public, but not keeping pace from behind, keeping pace from just a little bit ahead. You're running a little bit faster than the public. And the goal is to have the public's pace begin to match yours. You want to become the leader in the pack. And if the public's pace begins to match yours, then you can begin to lead them to where you want them to be. And where you want them to be may be quite ahead of where they currently are. That's leadership. And I suppose the way to conclude this is that the thing you can take from Lincoln is the importance of leadership, that takes seriously pluralism, that takes seriously the fact that people hold different views, but also takes seriously the fact that those views can change, that takes seriously the fact that you can maneuver around those views, that takes seriously the fact that with effort and a solid foundation, you can bring the public to a better place than it is to begin with. But that starts and ends with principles. And if you don't have them, you don't have anything.